Mr. Mark Geoghegan. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing really, really well. It's great to be on the show.
Mark, yes, thank you. It's a lot of fun. I got to know this before we really get into anything too serious. What is a very misunderstood responsibility, in your opinion?
I suppose, what about the responsibility of a journalist to the readership and to tell the truth? I think that's an interesting one, particularly as it's probably never been more in focus and in these times when these very divided political times all over the world. Yeah, that responsibility for a journalist to tell the truth, and probably knowing that there is no such thing as the truth. There's always going to be a subjective. Your subconscious mind is always going to be slightly subjective, but to get as close to it as you possibly can in a cold and as impartial as you can way.
Yeah, no, we're definitely going to get back to that in just a second. But for me, Mark, I'm curious if there's a continental divide here. But for me, a very misunderstood responsibility here is people that quote you takeout times for when you place an order at a restaurant to go pick up. I don't think they fully understand the power that they hold over your enjoyment of that food. It's just something that I think maybe needs a little bit more training, a little more education, and maybe just a little more communication as to what's going to go into that. But Mark, you definitely led me right down the path that I sort of kind of wanted to go to at least kick this thing off. And the idea of, like you said, journalist, and you would probably fall into the more professional realm of things, but with sort of the media, the new wave of insurance media, where people within inside the industry itself just sort of taking arms and communicating out to the people they want to talk to. Is there any maybe misunderstood responsibility that some of this information that's going around? Do you think that we're fully understanding sort of that back and forth dialogue that we've now created over the last decade or so?
I suppose the funny thing, isn't it, that with social media now everybody's a journalist, but of course none of them have had any training, and the amount of copyright violation that's routine, or the amount of just defamatory behavior that on Twitter, it's crazy that people chat all sorts of things and accuse people of all sorts of things that are completely defamatory, and they have no understanding that they're actually liable. They could be prosecuted for some of the things that they're saying. If you're making unsubstantiated claims, it's just simply saying something nasty about someone. If I said something nasty about you that would, in the mind of a judge, lower you in the opinion of a right-thinking person, there you go. I've defamed you, and I have defenses. It could be true. I mean, truth is a pretty good defense. But you might then argue that what I said about you was completely confidential, or it was in a matter of national security. I was just rewatching the great movie The Post, great journalism movie, and very apt for our times, as I was saying. It reminded me. I think there was probably a really good reason why Spielberg put that movie out and why he worked on that movie during this more difficult, this very divided political times that we're living through now. I think people don't understand the responsibility they have to understand that they're going to be held to the same standards, that they could be held to the same standards that a journalist is held to. And they should probably think more carefully before they, my grandmother would have said, Mark, think carefully before you open your mouth and before you say something that you might later regret. And it's so easy just to, now with, you've got them on your cell phone, you can just fire off a couple of things when you're angry, or you've had a couple of drinks, or in a bad mood, or you're, and you could spend a lot of time regretting those. And there's some great cases of people kind of sending a couple of tweets and then taking a long flight, and by the time they've landed, there's been a Twitter storm, and they've been fired, and they don't have the job that they had anymore through some moral outrage that they've caused or something. It's anyway, cautionary tales for everybody. Be careful what you say in public, because you're being held to a public standard at that point.
Mark, nobody's ever in a bad mood interacting with insurance. That doesn't happen.
Is anyone ever in a good mood? And obviously, the great cliche of insurance is, who wakes up in the morning and says, "Hey, I'm going to buy some new insurance today. Going to make me look good." It's a grudge purchase and a purchase, that no one buys insurance because they want to look good or be cool.
So I'm curious, being somebody that has sort of existed in the traditional form of journalist to now, you've moved yourself into we'll say the new wave of media, podcasting, all that fun stuff. Is there a big difference that stands out? Like, is there a liberation that you have somewhat felt, or how has that sort of transition impacted the way that you're able to communicate?
Oh, well, I'm really enjoying it. It's very different because, I was the editor of the Insurance Insider. The Insurance Insider is a subscription model, and that doesn't really work for podcasts. Podcasts probably need to be free to air, need to be free for the subscriber to just download, stick them on their phone, listen to in the car or whatever. And so it works better with a sponsorship and an advertising model. So I've got a few advertisers. So I've certainly found at the Insurance Insider that we would look through everything of the lens of will this drive more subscription revenue? And that was quite high price subscription revenue and also we were doing, the reason why we could charge such a high price was because we were doing investigative journalism. We were coming up with exclusives. We were saying this company's going to take over that company. This person's left that company. This company's going to have a bigger outsized loss from this hurricane than this other company. And it was all sensitive and valuable information to the right people, to people who are willing to pay for that. And so we ended up with the podcast phenomenon. When that came about, we were scratching our heads. There wasn't really a good way of leveraging that, because we could say, oh, we put it behind our paywall, and we'd say, is that a really good way of stopping people from lapsing their subscription? Or we could use it as another bit of leverage to say, hey, we're going to put the price of the subscription up because it's got, look at all the new stuff you've got included in the subscription. But in the end, it doesn't really work. You'd say, well, that's not really good use of Mark's time. Mark's time's probably better spent doing something else. And so the other big change for podcast is it doesn't really work. It's not like an investigative journalist medium in the way that I can't doorstop someone. I can't just knock on their door and say, hey, I've just heard that you've pulled out of doing this type of insurance. What do you got to say for yourself? In the way that I would do as a news journalist, say, hey, we've got this story. It's going to run tomorrow morning. What do you got to say for yourself? And and it's your chance to correct it if it's wrong. But at the same time, we're pretty confident. We've been to 3 different independent sources, that kind of stuff. So you're kind of battering someone's door down with a story. Whereas with a podcast, you can't do that, because if I asked you, Joey, and hey, what about this? And you say, well, I can't talk about that. Well, that's the end of the conversation. I can keep badgering you and pestering you, but actually it's not much of a podcast. A podcast is a consensual medium. You asked me to come on the show, and I've agreed, and then we've agreed to talk about whatever. And so, but what I've found liberating and surprising is to go from, I operated a lot off the record, where I'm talking to people on their their condition of anonymity, informing me probably about other people, and I'm verifying bits of information usually about their competitors or their peers. And now we're actually consenting to talk about something. And now actually we're going, because we've consented to talk about something, say, I can talk about this and I'm happy to talk about this, we're going into so much more detail. And my job is the job of really listening and trying to be the mind of the listener, and trying to think, what is the listener about to ask? To anticipate what questions now are forming in the listener's mind, so I would do all the questions in advance. I would never do that before. I would have all the questions in advance. I want to get people really comfortable. They can also have another listen back. So it's very, very soft compared to what I was doing before. But what's really surprised me is once someone is prepared and they are ready to talk about something, how much more detail that you manage to get into it, and that they're really happy for that to stay on the record. When I send it back to them, I think, oh, they're going to want to withdraw half these things they've said. They're going to think I've tricked them. I've lulled them into false sense of security, and they've probably said too much. And actually, most of the time, they never asked to withdraw anything, apart from maybe it's something where the legal department says, that thing we can't say about you opening a new office in Singapore because the authorities haven't approved it yet. Or we haven't even announced it internally, which is usually the biggest problem, because then that's the CEO is going to have half the people in their business saying, who's running Singapore, because they haven't told anyone yet. But those kind of things. So it's been really pleasantly surprising to go completely on the record in what would seem to be a softer medium, but it's so much more detailed. And really, really going to the nth degree, and people really enjoying that, and people finding a lot more value in that, because I suppose the spoken word is, there's so many. When we would run a glossy magazine feature with a CEO, you've only got 1,500 words or 2,000 words, and 3, 4, 5 pages, lots of nice pictures. But at the same time, but in a half-hour podcast, you're going to be doing 5,000-10,000 words easily. So it's you can get a lot more in there.
Yeah, I was going to kind of have you grade the quality of information. You kind of slipped into answering a little bit of that for me. But if you want to sort of assign a grade to that, like, what you feel like the quality of information that you're getting now is I would be interested. But more importantly, I think it's, what do you think is happening because of this sort of maybe level of detail that hasn't been unlocked before? Do you think we're seeing any sort of tangible changes or results in the industry as a result of being able to sort of pull back the curtain in a way that was maybe never accustomed to?
Oh, yeah, because it's really for the younger, for junior members of staff who are ambitious. Whereas before, we're all silent. I was in the insurance industry, I was working for the London Lloyd's broker, subsidiary of the biggest broker in Spain, which has ended up being part of Aon. But it took me years to kind of get a holistic view of what the insurance industry is, and to say, oh, well, the underwriter that I'm placing business with has bought some reinsurance, and therefore that underwriter is being affected by the reinsurance market just as much as, or that they've got a binder, or they've got this, or they've got their own worries. And you can have a bigger understanding, much quicker understanding of how everything is connected. And so I'm rather jealous of those 20-somethings who can devour all these podcasts, and they really get to understand, what makes the CEO get up in the morning, what worries the CEO, what's worrying the industry, and get a level of detail and understanding and nuance that we would never have been able to get 30 years ago. I mean, completely impossible. And we would have had to pick that up over through osmosis, and just by kind of asking people at the right time, and then, or just working it out for ourselves. They're very lucky in that sense. And I think there's going to be a big benefit to that, because when these people are going to be able to accelerate their careers, and they're going to be able to produce innovative insurance solutions. They're going to understand how things are all put together and how they might have to go straight to the capital markets. Before we were all kind of isolated, your listenership, being insurance agents and brokers in a local place would be connected to London via a chain of wholesale brokers and a Lloyd's broker. But now I think you can really understand. You can say, well, I can see what's happening, and I can get a flavor of what's going to happen and what I need to be prepared for my upcoming renewals. People are going to be aware before. Whereas before it was more reactive. You would sort of be taken by surprise that of course, the Lloyd's underwriters would be taken by surprise. I mean, the famous one was Hurricane Betsy in the 60s. They renewed all their book, and it was midway through the year that the Hurricane Betsy losses from the year before were coming through. And they suddenly realized that they weren't as solvent as they were. They had to quietly try and withdraw some of the lines they'd already put down. And that would never happen today. Today, with everything so much more connected, everyone's got an idea of exactly what Hurricane Ian is going to cost. Within a few weeks of it happening, and there are model outputs, there's PCS, there's all sorts of, there's so many things to go on, and everyone knows how that's likely to affect reinsurance pricing, and how that's the knock-on effect that's going to have to the local markets, to your insurance markets, and to your specialty markets, and how the war in Ukraine is going to affect your specialty markets. Everything's connected, and people, more importantly, understand the connections, so they're able to anticipate those, so they can just be better at what they do.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of that younger agent, the person just getting into the industry, and I guess what would you maybe say to that 20-something agent that's a couple years into the business in Des Moines, Iowa, that maybe has no idea what goes on across the pond? Like, what sort of misunderstandings would they possibly have, and the impact that it has on their sort of day-to-day business? Is there anything that you sort of can kind of help decloud for them?
Well, I think the most important thing is to know that anything that you can insure is going to, if you're in a small town, in a small town where there's only one, you have a client, they have a lot of really nice vanilla risk that you can place locally and that really well. And then suddenly they've got a helicopter, and then they're going to get in touch with you guys. And then you guys are probably going to get in touch with someone who's got a binder. If it's only one helicopter, maybe it'll be a binder thing you can put on through an MGU that's maybe backed by a Lloyd's syndicate. Or if it's a fleet of helicopters that are used for really nasty things like firefighting or dangerous stuff, or for fish spotting in the Pacific. But somebody somewhere can become an expert in helicopters and can aggregate them together into a book that's a meaningful couple of $100 million book of business, and then there'll be enough for them to pay big claims, and also for them to learn to become a real expert in make and model of helicopter, what type of turbine engine, how many hours the pilot really needs to, of hours on that make and model before so they can become a better risk, and any other risk management practices that go with it. So the point is to say, it doesn't matter how weird or wonderful it is, someone somewhere through the distribution network that we all have, through brokers, through wholesale brokers like yourselves, who are all connected around the world, you can aggregate almost anything. But then I wouldn't look at it as just, obviously, I'm saying you can solve any problem, but also you can go and find new products. And that's to know that you are connected to a distribution chain that's completely global and is licensed in your state. So if you're really a real go-ahead kind of insurance broker who wants to have something that the guy next door doesn't have, then go for all this new stuff and learn about cyber cover, become the expert, learn about new cover. What about intellectual property cover? It's all just about to happen, covering all the intangible risk on your client's balance sheets that 80 years ago, when it was your granddad's time, all the assets were pretty physical and you could go and touch them. They were the property, and then there was liability and other things. But now a lot of these assets are intellectual property. They're bound up in sort of electronic coding. How do you insure those? It's much harder to insure those, but we will work out ways of doing it. And if you're one of those people, then you're going to do so much better than the guy who's still insuring, what if autonomous vehicles happen? And then they suddenly become a product. And then it becomes they're more of a product liability and a programmer's professional indemnity risk. They're not actually a property risk anymore in the same way. And because people probably won't own them, they'll probably rent them. 50 years' time, if there really is driverless cars, is anyone actually going to insure their car? So what happens to the auto line of business? So I'd say get yourself ahead of the curve, go and connect, and there is a solution to every problem, and there are new products that you've probably never heard of. And go and find out about them, because if you can become one of the people who can sell that locally, you're going to do so much better than the guy next door to you.
Yeah, you mentioned cyber, IP. You covered a lot of the big ones, and then you got to self-driving cars. Is there something aggregating now besides maybe those three that really has you excited, or that you think is maybe the next big opportunity?
There's so much stuff that you would not believe what's going on. And in London, we're really lucky because it's a crucible of this kind of stuff. Because it's a visible market, that's a physical market. You can see it, you can touch it. It's one of the only places in the world there's actually an insurance district where everybody is an insurance guy. And the same happens on Bermuda. It's a tiny place with 60,000 people, but 60,000 people who all do insurance and reinsurance. And it's amazing. So you can physically see all the people that all of the whole market is there, and they kind of own the island in many ways. They're the biggest employer on the island. You go and get a taxi from the airport in Bermuda, and the cab driver knows about reinsurance because their children work in reinsurance, or it turns out they're retired and they used to work in a reinsurer. And London's a bit like that as well. So it's one of these physical places where, for example, there's an innovation centre in Lloyd's of London called the Lloyd's Lab, and it's on about its sixth cohort. And these are specifically rooting out interesting, often what we'd call insurtech businesses, but not all of them are, but just anything that's innovative. They've got an innovation facility where a lot of the syndicates have pooled capacity to say, let's back some things that are a bit weird, where we wouldn't have any experience. We can't go to experience rating. There's no actuarial table to tell us what to charge for this. So let's do the old-fashioned way. Let's just suck it and see. And the way that Cuthbert Heath of Lloyd's, famously insured the Wright brothers. Someone's got to be the first one to have a go at aviation insurance. And now aviation insurance is kind of a core line. Everyone knows roughly what to price. But when people were just inventing flight, then it was quite difficult. And I'm sure it was the same was original in the 1880s when the first motor cars, when the Daimlers and, were being invented. They were crazy things. They were like space rockets. And of course, now we insure space rockets as well. So, and of course, space is actually quite a standard line of specialty business. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? And you can insure satellites in orbit. You can insure launches. You can insure all sorts of things. They tend to be things where insurance works the best when it adds a real multiplier effect to capitalism. Insurance is the really good bit of capitalism. There's a new business within the Lloyd's Lab called Kita, for example, that is insuring carbon capture, but it's allowing more of it to happen. So it's almost insuring the carbon credit. Say a bank wants to lend some money to someone to build a wind farm somewhere, and obviously there's going to be carbon credits on that basis. But if they can get the insurance, if they can get a particular type of insurance to guarantee that the credit will be valid, then they could lend more. So it means you can get more wind farms built. And there's a lot going on in the parametric sphere. So this is a parameter. Rather than having indemnity insurance say, if you have a loss, I'll come and fix it. If a parameter is exceeded, or a binary thing, if this happens, if this parameter is exceeded, then we'll pay out. So there's a lot of good stuff happening with flood, a lot of really good stuff happening with cargo. There's a business called Parcel that's got these sensors that that freight forwarders or that all the owners of the cargo can just put into the packaging. This is for temperature sensitive cargo. It knows it's a tiny little sensor. They only cost a couple of bucks. And so it really works. Obviously, you don't have to have a hugely expensive cargo for it to go in there. You can just chuck a couple of these little sensors in there. and you can just interrogate them. The cargo arrives completely spoiled at its destination, and it will show you the history of what temperature it was every hour for the last 3 months, and it'll show that actually the moment as soon as it got to the I don't know, one of the freight forwarders' offices, it was the wrong temperature, and it wasn't actually your fault. And we know, and straight away whose problem it was with the cargo, for example. So cargo going long distance, again, but that's fantastic. Technology is doing a lot of, and that's just simply a parameter saying, well, did it go over this temperature Fahrenheit or not? And there's thousands and thousands of applications in that way. There's a great business called Flood Flash, which is actually coming to the States. They've got a sensor, a kind of tube that they put on the wall of the kind of place that's always getting flooded, or where in a flood area where it's difficult to get onto different programs and carriers are really nervous of giving you coverage. Well, this can do it in a completely different way. You just put it on the wall at a certain height that you've agreed, and if it gets wet, and it's tamper-proof, of course. If it gets wet, you just get a payout, and you have a pre-agreed payout. So it's not even. It's just a pure pre-agreed benefit. That's built in with a lot of technology to do a lot of preemption of that loss, to say, hey, those insureds, when they get the cash straight away. Often they get the cash before they even know they've got a loss. So that's good insurance. You don't even have to, and great insurance where you don't have to make a claim. I mean, that's wonderful. Who likes making a claim? So there's a ton of stuff going on, and it's only the penetration is just starting, and that some of those things have been proven. Those concepts are now proven, and now they're in the distribution phase. So watch for some of these things coming near you, but there's so many more interesting ones as well. I mean, and they're being cooked up all the time.
All right, Mark, I've got 3 more questions for you, sir. And the first one is, what's one thing you hope you never forget?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, that money doesn't grow on trees. I think the capacity is never infinite, I would say, in insurance. It comes from somewhere. It's a human marketplace. We've got a really interesting situation in reinsurance where reinsurers have not made any money for ages. They've barely made their cost of capital. And they used to have a playbook where you'd have a big hurricane or something, a big loss, like after Hurricane Andrew, like after Karina, Rita, and Wilma in 2005, where you could go and set up a new insurance company. You could get venture capital to back you to say, hey, the price of insurance is going to double, and we're going to have a really good chance of making really good returns, obviously with the caveat that there might be another hurricane next year. But the probability is that we won't have a hurricane. But now we've had a situation since 2017, since Irma, that the investors don't really believe the story anymore, because people they ponied up more money in 2018, they lost it. They ponied up money in 2019, they lost it. 2021, then COVID, and they lost it. They said, well, the market's really, and now they're almost on strike. And so to say that, don't forget that it's humans who make these decisions. And even though the theoretical price is, very, very good, and is going to probably be much better theoretically, their returns are going to be fantastically better than they have been before. In practice, people just feel, that there's a psychological effect. They're human. They don't want to be the guy who ponied up the 5th time in a row and lost his shirt five years in a row. It's funny that that underwriter sort of they don't want to lose again, and they don't want to be seen to lose again.
Now, on the other side of that, Mark, what's one thing you still have yet to learn?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, to find out, I suppose, yes, find out what else I could do. What else I could do? Another way of making a living that I would enjoy as much as this. I've been very lucky. I got into insurance because I wanted to speak Spanish all day, and I worked for a big Spanish broker, and I was able to live in Spain. And then I got married to a Spaniard, and then Pat Ryan's business took over the business I was working for, and then I went off to become a journalist because that was this other thing I really wanted to do. And then it was hard to be a bilingual journalist. So anyway, I had the logic that I had Spanish at home, so I could speak Spanish all day at home when I got home, so I didn't have to speak Spanish all day at work, so I could do an English-speaking job like a journalist, where you really need to be working in your mother tongue. And I've absolutely loved that. That completely took off. And then I learned that I had 5 years being a journalist having absolutely nothing to do with insurance. And I didn't get out of insurance because I found it boring. I got out of it because I wasn't very good at renewing the same thing every year. I got bored of renewing the same thing every year. I really found it interesting solving new problems. So I should only have been ever on new business, because once it got to renewing the same thing, it was just arguing about money and coverage and that kind of stuff. And I wasn't actually as good at that as finding solutions to new problems. And then I had a chance to become an insurance journalist, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, is that going backwards, writing about insurance? But it turned out that was the best thing I ever did, because I was bringing together my journalistic experience of about 5 years and this about had been 9 years as an international insurance and reinsurance broker, and suddenly I had something special. It was this kind of being a generalist and then bringing two things that there were very, very few journalists who had ever worked in insurance, and then you suddenly felt like that gave you a superpower, and you could talk to people in a slightly different language, and so that helped kind of turbocharge my career. And so I'm wondering what else I could do that would. And now I'm an insurance podcaster. I'm one of the only ones who's sort of doing it on their own. I wonder what else I could do. I don't know. I'll tell you in about 10 years' time.
Fair enough. Last question to you, Mark. If I were to hand you a magic wand of sorts to reshape, change, alter, speed up, really any part of insurance, what's that thing? Where is it going? And what's it doing?
I would digitize everything from the first moment it exists and get rid of paper completely, because this is where all the solutions are going to come from, and getting rid of that frictional cost. There's no reason why. I interview someone like David Howden, who's, this is a UK broker. There's a big brokerage in the UK called Howden, a big international brokerage, not an insurance broker in the States, but more on the wholesale side. And you can see a future in which, oddly, this is quite scary for all of us, in which brokerage might tend down to zero. A bit like when you bought stocks 30 years ago. I don't know what you used to pay, $30 a trade, and then the internet came along and it went down to $10, and there was Charles Schwab and whatever else, and now there's Robinhood and it's free, and they're being paid for deal flow. Maybe we should all be looking forward to a world in which there's no brokerage, there's very little frictional cost, but of course there's a huge amount of added value that we can have. That's the transaction is not the added value. The transaction is nothing. That's just bread and butter stuff. The value is in the knowledge and the advice, and knowing how much insurance is available, how much the client actually should buy, what would be prudent, and roughly knowing how much it's going to cost, and what are the ins and outs of the coverage, and knowing exactly what coverage to get, and to go with this policy, not that policy, because that clause is better than that clause, and all this other stuff, and having that time to really work with that client. Because if everything's digitized, it could be really genuinely global at that point. And you could be talking about a really global, really competitive marketplace, where you can access in a very small town in a state in the US, you could be accessing some incredibly sophisticated tools and policies and solutions for your client that you wouldn't be able to imagine before. And that's a really, really good thing. Who knows? We would end up with insurance day traders, or it could be completely crazy. I mean, there'll be so much stuff happening, and things will move a lot faster, I think. And but it will only be good for clients in the end, that they'll get much better coverage, much more appropriate levels of coverage at the right price.
Mark, this has been fantastic, sir. I'm going to leave it right there.
Thank you very much, Joe. I really enjoyed chatting to you.